Welcome to the Infinite Women podcast. I'm your host, Allison Tyra, and today I'm joined by Anna von Mertens, a visual artist and author of the book Attention is Discovery, The Life and Legacy of Astronomer Henrietta Leavitt. So why don't we start with her life and then we can get into her legacy.
So Henrietta Leavitt was an astronomer who worked at the Harvard College Observatory right towards the end of the 19th century, early 20th century. And she made a discovery studying glass plate photographs that allowed astronomers to measure large-scale astronomical distance for the very first time. So in these stories about women scientists that don't get full recognition, often you look behind a groundbreaking discovery and there is the work of a woman there. Lo and behold, Henrietta Leavitt's work is indeed behind the work of such legends like Edwin Hubble and Harlow Shapley. And it's not an exaggeration to say that her discovery founded modern cosmology because so much understanding rippled forth from her finding. So Henrietta Leavitt was born in 1868, and she was born in Massachusetts. And her father was a minister. They moved to Ohio in her teenage years, and her family was supportive of education for women at the time. That was not a typical belief. Women's colleges were just starting to form, particularly on the East Coast. But her family very much did support education, and moving to Ohio, she took classes at Oberlin, and she was an amazing scholar, an amazing student. And when her family returned to Cambridge, Massachusetts, she took classes at what would be soon known as Radcliffe College. So she had 6 years of intensive study. However, Radcliffe did not yet issue degrees, so she completed her studies of what would be a bachelorette degree if she were a man. But she had this sort of very rich, deep education. And in her final year, she took an astronomy class. It wasn't until that point in time that she looked at astronomy. There was some affinity she felt there because she volunteered at the Harvard College Observatory for several years after her Radcliffe studies. And then there's a few years where we don't quite know what she was up to. She was an art teacher. She traveled to Europe, but it was in the early 20th century where she landed back at Harvard College Observatory. And her job there was studying astronomical glass plate photographs of the night sky. These were plates of glass that were coated with a light-sensitive emulsion placed in a telescope. And so each star, once exposed, registered as a tiny black speck. And if you think of sort of pepper scattered across a glass surface, that was what her data was. That was how she studied the stars. And from the study of these inverted, starlight, she made this foundational discovery that changed our understanding of the cosmos. So when Leavitt began her studies of the stars on these glass plates, we have to bring our minds back to the sense that almost nothing was known about the stars in the sky. So in particular, there's no sense of depth to the stars. There was no way to know, well, if there were two lights in the night sky, was one that shone brighter? Did that mean it was an intrinsically larger celestial object? Or did that simply mean that it was equally bright as a dim star, but it was closer to us? There was no way to measure distance, any sense of depth to the night sky. And so Leavitt in her work, sort of one of the only pieces available to her was a measurement of apparent brightness. So that's what she did, is she began to catalog the brightness of stars as they appeared on her glass plates. And in that process, she knew that some of those stars changed in their brightness over time, these so-called variable stars. And again, almost nothing was known about these variable stars, but she just, following her attention, would see where this line of research led her. And where it led her, her groundbreaking discovery was in the study of variable stars. She established this direct relationship between how bright a variable star was and how long it took to pulse, how long it went to go from dim to bright and back to dim again, this cycle of brightening. And in this direct relationship, when she graphed this relationship in variable stars, the relationship held so true that this very smooth logarithmic curve was produced. And because of the smoothness of that curve, astronomers knew they could simply go out, and once her relationship was calibrated to physical distance, astronomers could go out into the night sky, see one of her variable stars, watch how long it took to pulse, and just based on that information, use this a little simple formula, the inverse square law, to calculate how far away that star was. So, in simple terms, Henrietta Leavitt gave astronomers this tool to measure distance, and it was simply by making an observation of sort of watching this star blink based on the length of time it took to blink. That was all the information they knew to show how far away it was. And this was put to immediate use in astonishing ways. And Harlow Shapley established the size and shape of our Milky Way, and it was far vaster than anyone had previously conceived. Equally significant, our sun, our host star, was at the edges of this structure. So suddenly, not only is there this expanse of space that we didn't realize, but we're also at the periphery of it. So this was a profound sort of existential, almost, right, reorientation of where we were in our universe. But then right after that, Edwin Hubble famously found one of Leavitt's Cepheid variable stars in the Andromeda Nebula, as it was called at the time, and proved it was so far away it had to be outside of the bounds that Shapley had just defined. So Edwin Hubble proved that there were galaxies beyond our own. And then in quick succession, each time he found a variable star in these spiral nebulae that he was studying, each time he found a variable star, he could measure its distance and find these galaxies surrounding us. And not only that, he could prove that in the redshift of light, the galaxies were receding from us. So our universe was expanding. So within a decade, we go from not having a sense of depth to the night sky to realizing the vastness of space and that universe is dynamic.
Since you mentioned Hubble, I do have to let everyone know that I have another episode on Nancy Grace Roman, who was known as the mother of Hubble in the context of the Hubble Space Telescope at NASA. So go listen to that one after you listen to this one.
That's what's amazing is not only did Leavitt's discovery found modern cosmology, but her discovery remains central to contemporary cosmology inquiry. So Wendy Friedman, who led the key project on the Hubble Space Telescope, used these variable stars, these very special kind of stars, as a way to measure the expansion rate of our universe. So still, Leavitt's discovery is right there at the center of our understanding of who we are and where we are.
One of the things that's really fascinating about her story is that she was part of a group at the Harvard College Observatory at this time. And the HCO is known, at least in women's history circles, for the fact that quite a few women there were doing this incredible, groundbreaking work that still impacts how astronomy functions today. And biographies of dozens of those women are available on the Harvard Plate Stacks website, whose administrators have also very kindly allowed me to share those on Infinite Women as well. So thank you to them. But are there any other women in particular that you'd like to mention? Because it's very important to know that Leavitt wasn't the only woman doing this kind of groundbreaking work in this space at that time.
Absolutely. Yeah, there was a really unique historical context around Leavitt's work. And that was, in particular, that this glass plate technology that we've been talking about, dry plate photography, was a brand new technology. And what it allowed to do was these multiple hour exposures, which gathered the starlight onto the glass plates, pulled dim stars into view and allowed the stars to be studied en masse. So thousands of stars could be held on a singular plate for study versus, right, that like object by object, slow, subjective looking through the eye of a telescope. So with this new technology came an enormous radical shift in how astronomy research was conducted. But what's interesting is that with this first set of big data to enter the field of astronomy, with that became a need for a labor force to analyze this data to make it manageable. So Edward Pickering, who is the director of the Harvard College Observatory, he had a limited budget. Despite being at Harvard, he did not receive university funding. He did have a limited budget. So with that limited budget, he realized, well, if I hire women, they can be hired, they can be a cheaper labor force than men. But he had this need for labor and it could fit within his observatory budget. So women, he hired this group of women, now known as the Harvard Computers, and they set to work analyzing this data and making it more manageable. And the idea was that they would, reduce the plates was their job, and sort of present this data to the astronomical community that future discoveries could be made from. Lo and behold, given access to that data, they went ahead and made those discoveries themselves. And I love that little subversive twist is that at the time, it was believed that a woman's disposition was too fragile to endure the long, cold nights of observations using a telescope. So instead, they worked by daylight analyzing the glass plates. But it was as if the men behind the eye of the telescopes hadn't caught up to where the field was at. So the women were like, great, you make the photographs. That's not the problem. The science is on, is held on those glass plates. And so they had first access to that sort of front row seat of discovery. So Leavitt was working with this group of women. An extremely remarkable fact about this group of women is that almost without exception, none of these women chose to marry and none of them had children. Now, this was a group of white, middle, and upper class women. That was a very outlying choice for that time. Women were very much expected, if not demanded, to be married. And so it was a very outlying choice. And what I found, of course, there are individual reasons behind each one of those choices. But collectively, what I noticed is that they had absolute passion and engagement with the work. They cared about the work. And through that caring for the work, they became a kind of family that got care for each other. So these women, most of the women worked their entire lifetimes at the observatory. Leavitt's life was cut short by cancer, but she worked there for her entire lifetime. Same with Annie Jump Cannon. I went through the records, and there are these Gill sisters, Edith and Mabel Gill, and they worked there 38 years and 35 years. Lillian Hodgson worked there 48 years. Like, these women spent decades building a career. And what that also allowed them to do was to know the science extremely well. So yes, Leavitt's discovery was foundational to cosmology and the understanding of our three-dimensional universe. But someone like Annie Jump Cannon, she studied stellar spectra. And so in analyzing this dispersion of starlight, these sort of so-called fingerprints, there were hints at the chemical composition of the stars, again, which nothing was really understood at the time. And in her categorization of these stellar spectra, she paved the way for understanding that stars evolve. And so our understanding of stellar evolution entirely became based from the foundation of Annie Jump Cannon's work. One thing that's interesting that I'll say is that I really want to celebrate Leavitt's work and really see that it's like she found the exact right career in science for her brain and for her mind. And what I noticed is that Edward Pickering, the director of the observatory, they shared that understanding, that they really believed in sort of this methodical sort of understanding of a broad base of information that all future research could be based on. And they shared that approach, and you can really see in the respect for each other. For one thing, Leavitt was able to publish her scientific papers under her own name, which is extraordinary for that time. So there was a deep respect there. I do also want to say that there were some limitations. So someone like Antonia Mowry is a brilliant mind. She worked at the Harvard College Observatory alongside Leavitt. However, she had a different approach than Pickering and Leavitt. She really wanted to dive deep into the specificity of a very sort of narrower lens and follow that, see where that path led her. And I will say that wasn't a good match with Pickering's leadership. And so she continually came and left the observatory. It was like she knew that access to the glass plates and was where research was located, but there was a fraught tension in terms of how she could conduct her own research. So I do want to point that out, that it wasn't complete nirvana. That for certain women, certain paths of research really could be pursued, and others it was more challenging. But I do want to say, broadly speaking, that the Harvard Computers had a great commitment to the work and an enormous degree of agency to follow their own paths of interest.
Now, I'm always a little torn on men like Pickering because he did give these women opportunities, like you were saying, but like you were also saying, he knew he could pay them less. And so there was sort of that double motivation there, but also when we look at this group of women as a whole, both Leavitt and Annie Jump Cannon were deaf or had hearing loss. Another woman, Williamina Patton Fleming, was a single mom, and she was actually Pickering's maid when he recruited her. So while there certainly wasn't, racial diversity in this group, he is giving opportunities to women that otherwise may not have had them. And so I want to like him, but the whole I can pay them less is kind of a
Yes,
sticking point for me.
Absolutely. And it is a question I asked myself of like, okay, basically essentially like, is Pickering a good guy? And what I resoundingly found, considering again that time and context, was absolutely yes. And I spoke with Davis Sobel, who's the author of The Glass Universe, about this. And literally the same, I asked her the same question. I'm like, I feel like Pickering was a good guy. And she's like, absolutely. And so let me celebrate some of the things that he did. So for sure, he did not pay these women the same wage as men. That was standard for that time. What he did give was an entry point into the sciences that was completely unavailable to women. So there was no career in the sciences. Yet yes, these women's colleges were starting to emerge, and women were studying astronomy, majoring in astronomy. After that, there was no job career available. It was more that they were educated for the purposes of becoming mothers. So that was an actual philosophical belief. Like, we'll educate you so that you can better educate your son. Like, so the fact that this door was open to the scientists, however small that door was, there was only, sort of one entry level job position. Within that, there was a certain degree of expansiveness, so that Leavitt, in assessing the stellar magnitude work, turned her research towards variable stars, and there was full permission to follow that wherever that path of interest led her. So there was quite a bit of agency within that, with that opportunity that he gave. Also, again, the fact that these women mostly published their papers under their own name, another extraordinary piece of evidence of how much respect was given to these women. And the example you mentioned of Wilhelmina Fleming, she was one of the first Harvard computers hired. She was a Scottish immigrant, arrived pregnant and abandoned by her husband. And so and was first, as you said, hired as a maid in Pickering's home on the observatory grounds. To hire a single mother, right, who is a Scottish immigrant, that is not ordinary circumstances for that time, but also much less to turn and say, okay, I think you would also be good at this work. And I write about this in my book, that in some way there's this story of Pickering. He had men who were working as computers, and he was frustrated with their quality of their work. And there's this apocryphal sort of story that he turned to Fleming, his maid, and said, like, my Scottish maid could do better. And there's no evidence that's a true story. But what I think is interesting there, right? So he turned to the closest woman at hand. And in some ways, it's sort of like there is truth to that, right? He turned literally to the woman closest at hand. And lo and behold, she was brilliant. And she excelled at this work. She worked at the observatory the rest of her life. She discovered the Horsehead Nebula. She discovered novae. And she kept the entire ship of the observatory running. So this woman was extraordinarily accomplished. It strikes me that a woman close at hand could have such brilliance, and how many women of total brilliance were not given any opportunity to see where the path might lead them. So I do really appreciate Pickering for the entry into the sciences that he helped form for women. But there was also just such evident in the correspondence, in their dialogue of research, how much deep respect he had for the science that they did. I mean, the fact that none of these women married and they had 30, 40-year careers, I mean, there just are no other examples of that, so it really was this particular point in the field of astronomy as it shifted. Like I said, because people hadn't quite caught up with where the field was, that women were given this complete dominance of the field, and then they were like, "Oh, wait, we'll quickly catch up," and never mind, you don't get that full access, But it really was a very special time where the Harvard computers were a collective, and there was support for each other, but within that, really individual brilliance and individual lines of research. Sometimes when you clump a group of women scientists together, it's like, oh, we'll broadly speak about theirs. And they, had different personalities, different ways that their minds were sort of extraordinary, different lines of research. So really pointing out how that group of support allowed individuals to shine so brightly.
And so, one of the things that is unfortunately not uncommon with women's history is that either contemporaneously, like during their lives, or after their deaths, we see these tellings of their story that diminish them and their accomplishments. So, with the Harvard College Observatory women, it was referring to them as Pickering's harem, which I hadn't realized that that wasn't a contemporaneous term that apparently came later as sort of this way to kind of tear them down and undermine everything that they'd accomplished.
Yes, absolutely. And that's exactly what in doing the research for the book that I uncovered is that yes, it's a term I was sort of thinking of, okay, how do I deal with this term and how it was applied? And then I realized, oh, wait, this is a retroactive term. This is a term applied later, which really diminishes the extraordinary science they produced. That was something that I myself sort of had to check with is that so often it is not the sexism that occurs during the time that these women lived, but it is the sexism of today or the recent past of how we tell history that really needs fixing. So that's one of my intentions was to recognize and celebrate how these women were seen in their lifetime. So Annie Jump Cannon has scrapbooks that are just filled with newspaper articles, just talking about there's these women working at Harvard College Observatory and they're producing all of these findings. So that was one public recognition, but very significantly for me is looking at the archive and seeing how many international astronomers were writing Edward Pickering, the director, and saying, can you tell me the latest on Leavitt's research? Like, so her research was broadcast broadly to the world. It was seen and recognized. And then it was like, great, we see the significance of this. Can you tell us more? So Harlow Shapley, when he was connecting his research, was like a monthly letter campaign of like, any news, any news, any news. And so he was waiting with bated breath of like, she is the expert. She is telling us how we can proceed. And so that was something that was really beautiful to see is that yes, these women were deeply in this, very intensive study of these glass plate photographs, but their work was seen in such a beautiful way. And the most poignant evidence of that was when, after Leavitt died, a week after a letter arrived to the observatory from Leavitt's mother, and she wrote the director and said, she thanked for the flowers and the condolences, but this one line said that while she was so modest about it, a comment from her every once in a while let me know that she knew the standing she had among the astronomers. And that was just such a beautiful thing that Leavitt was doing this hard work and seen and appreciated for doing that hard work in her lifetime.
Well, and as you were saying that, I was just thinking back to Pickering can have multiple motivations for doing things. So, on the one hand, I'm sure he promoted these women and their work. I would hope because, he was proud of them and he wanted to share their accomplishments. But from a more mercenary standpoint, that's also elevating the status and profile of his observatory and hopefully getting him more funding from various sources. So, it doesn't have to be just one or the other. People are complex, and it's okay.
Right, absolutely. Although I'll give a few more points to Pickering on this. One, it was very standard for the director just to write, to put his name on it. So he could have authored these papers, and he chose not to do that. But a very significant turning point in Leavitt's lifetime that I analyzed in the book that Leavitt made her groundbreaking discovery in 1912. She lived for 9 more years. And after that groundbreaking discovery, her work was turned towards standardizing photographic magnitudes. And, it is as boring as it sounds. And I was so frustrated of like, wait, why is this brilliant mind turned back towards standardizing photographic magnitudes? And so looking at this issue, I realized a couple things. Was one, this new technology, this new photography, it didn't translate stars directly one to one onto the plates. There was a mediation of how starlight was captured in the photograph, and that needed to be understood. And it was incredibly complex work, and Leavitt was an expert in that. So what I realized is that Pickering and Leavitt together, they wanted to move the field of astronomy forward. And the only way, right, any research can be conducted is if we understand what that data is, how that data held on those glass plate photographs corresponds to the actual like objects in the sky. So one, I realized that her work standardizing photographic magnitudes was essential and foundational, and just central to astronomical knowledge. But what I also realized about Pickering, I was like, wait, he could have heralded, oh, my, Leavitt here at the observatory made this groundbreaking discovery and sort of really heralded that research. He was so committed alongside Leavitt to say, but how do we most effectively move the field of astronomy forward? So I do actually think that Pickering, yes, he had an ego, and yes, he was an excellent politician in terms of orchestrating things getting done. But he so sincerely was an observation, he was an observational astronomer at his heart. And the work that Leavitt did was very in line with how he felt he could most effectively serve the astronomical community. So Davis Sobel and I agree, like Pickering's a good guy. I'll stand by it.
It's also interesting that you're kind of pointing out that sometimes the stuff that sounds really boring and may actually be really boring to implement is also incredibly important, and it's what makes things work.
Oh, absolutely. That is true across the sciences, as you say, right? If you're a biologist, there is some really repetitive, boring work that needs to happen, but we don't recognize when male scientists do that. That's not emphasized of like, oh, that routine work, that you've been doing. So I do notice how gendered those actions get. But when I put my own sort of frustration aside, I'm like, all right, let me dive in. How did she standardize these magnitudes? Lo and behold, this work was so complex, and it would be a whole rabbit hole to take you down. I could barely understand it. It was the part of my research that I had to spend the most time with to be like, what on earth was she doing? There were these multiple exposure photographs where stars would appear multiple times. She would siphon off percentages of starlight in the photographic record. It was bananas, the work. And so that work was actually quite complex. Yes, it was distilled into this elegant final bit of information, but the complexity to arrive there was just astounding. So all the more respect for Leavitt for doing that work. All the strange unpredictability of that medium at that time was really something she had to deal with. So
I actually have other episodes with Dr. Toner Stevenson about Australian astronomers, and in the one that we did about the astrographic catalog, she actually does get into the mechanics a bit more of how these plates were made. So please go listen to that episode. But I do also find that a lot of times women were assigned the tedious work under this very thin veil of sexism that was like, oh, women are just better at this, detail work. And the interesting thing that you find is a lot of times that led to them making discoveries because they were relegated to that more tedious business.
exactly that. I mean, this work was actually called women's work. This work of analyzing these glass plate photographs, because it was so detailed, and it was this very precise work. That exact tie between embroidery and training, from a young age, a girl's hand and eye. And that specificity. So, it was directly related to analyzing these glass plates. But like you said, that's where the science is. Like all science requires a certain level of replicating your results, right? When you create an experiment and replicate that, those are tedious steps, and precision and care, are required. So it's just that we, need to take the gender away and just recognize, oh, this is what science is.
Now, I'm always curious when I'm talking to somebody who has written an entire book about someone, why her? And particularly because you're an artist, you're not an academic, you're not a scientist. And especially in this context, acknowledging that there were a lot of really badass women doing incredible work just in this context. So, what was it about Henrietta Leavitt that made you say, oh, yeah, I need to really do a deep dive on her?
Yes, I know it was quite an encounter that I did not see this coming. As you said, I'm a visual artist. I come from a quilt making practice. I use quilts as a medium to sort of hold the ideas that I'm interested in studying, and a lot of my work was revolving around systems of mapping, those associations of quilt with the bed and the home and the place of the familiar, and this boundary between sort of the known and the unknown. So I was working with these themes, and then I was invited to the Harvard Radcliffe Institute to develop a research-based exhibition. And I was interested in astronomy as an extension of that sort of how we orient ourselves, right? How we find our place in our world. And so, just based on my interest in astronomy, I went and toured the glass plate collection housed at the Harvard College Observatory. And some of the plates were pulled out from the collection for me to view. And looking at these plates, that was the moment I first heard Henrietta Leavitt's name. I, studying these glass plate photographs, looking at them, that the ones that she studied, I learned how she made this discovery that would launch modern cosmology. And again, I'd never heard of her name before. And I was thinking, like, wait, she is sort of my own origin story, not just the origin story for how we understand our three-dimensional universe, but my own interest in orientation as a way to sort of existentially frame and make sense of meaning in these very strange human lives that we live. That Leavitt was the source of that. And so that made me follow her story. And the deeper I followed it, only the more interesting it became, learning that she was part of this group of women in this very unique historical context, and just how profound and ongoing her discovery was. Made me know that I wanted to center my work around this story and help tell that story through time.
Join us next time on the Infinite Women podcast, and remember, well behaved women rarely make history.